Hello, everyone joining us. We're just going to wait till a couple more minutes and then we'll hand you over to Nick. We're just going to let everyone into the room. Thank you. Well, Nick, I think we're kind of 1 o'clock, so happy for you to kick off.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Good. Great. Thanks also. A very warm welcome to today's Geological Society Energy Transition Insights webinar, where we're going to talk about the role of mining in the circular economy. And we're delighted to welcome a panel of experts who have gamely agreed to give up their lunch hour to inform and educate us. I will introduce the panel shortly, but firstly, I'd like to say thank you to the Geological Society for hosting this, and special thanks to Amelia Spothwell-Jones for all the tech organisation. I've also been asked to remind everyone that the Geological Society has a duty to provide a safe, productive and welcoming environment for all attendees of our events. Whilst attending this event, you must adhere to our event code of conduct at all times, which Amelia will put in the chat. So firstly, I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Katie Jones, who is the Policy and Communications Officer at the GeoSoc. Katie, would you like to say a few words about the Society, just to introduce? We can't hear you, Katie, sorry. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Great.
Okay, great. Sorry, they worked a minute ago, as is the
did.
case. Hi, everyone. My name's Katie Jones. I'm the Policy and Communications Officer at the Geological Society. And as the National Forum for Debate and Cutting Edge Earth Science, the Society has a special responsibility to communicate this science to the public, to the media, and to the government itself. So myself and Head of Policy, Dr. Megan O'Donnell, do this on behalf of the geoscience community by communicating geological information to support evidence-based policy making, hosting and attending policy-relevant meetings such as this one, supporting our members and communicating their expertise with policymakers. So the Geological Society's energy transition theme champions the goal of driving future earth science research and supports communication between academia, business, government and public communities. It importantly aims to inspire a new generation of geoscientists who are uniquely placed to support policymakers, stakeholders and industry in the energy transition. So I'm delighted to join Nick today as co-chair for this webinar and to have such a fantastic array of panelists joining us. That's enough from me. I'll pass back to Nick.
Thanks very much, Katie. So today we're going to be discussing the role of mining in a circular economy. And I'm sure most people on this call are aware that the race to net zero wholesale decarbonisation will involve a significant uptick in metal supply, which in the short term, for a number of reasons, will be overwhelmingly sourced from mine supply. This is what we understand. And thus there is a call to arms to improve exploration success, invest in metallurgical processes, etc. However, a long-term goal embodied in many governments and supranational organizations' critical mineral strategies is the development of a circular economy whereby production and consumption of such metals will increasingly come from recycle and reuse. But I guess, you know, this begs a number of questions. Is such a circular economy possible? What will it look like? What are the environmental impacts of this shift from mining to metal supply from recycling? And what would the role of mining be in this model at the end state, whatever the end state is, and the role of geoscience in enabling and supporting this? And we're delighted to be joined by 4 experts from academia, industry, and NGOs to discuss this topic. So I'll introduce the panel in no particular order. So first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Eva Marquis, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter, based in the Campbell School of Mines and also the Environmental and Sustainability Institute. Her work is within the UKRI Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Centre for Technology Metals, which is more conveniently known as MET4Tech, where she focuses on developing circular economy geomodels for technology metals. Her work utilizes mineralogy, geochemistry, and geomodeling to gain insight into where technology metals are concentrated in ore deposits and mine wastes, and consider how circular economy principles can be integrated into geomodels and deposit evaluation. Dr. Gavin Mudd is the new director of the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre, part of the British Geological Survey. He was previously the Associate Professor in the Department of Environmental Engineering at RMIT University, Melbourne, Australia, and he moved over here a few months ago and is enjoying the UK spring. His research interests include the environmental impacts, sustainability frameworks, life cycle assessment modelling of mining and mine supply, and mine rehabilitation. Thank you and welcome. Lucy Smith, Dr. Lucy Smith is the head of transformation at the Materials Processing Institute. She is responsible for the optimization and delivery of business processes across the MPI and drives new and existing company initiatives and strategic opportunities. Lucy is also responsible for the development of venture opportunities within the Institute, managing and driving the Institute's ventures portfolio, including identifying spin-outs to accelerate scale-up on their commercialization journey. She has a background in materials, sustainability, and life cycle assessment, and is now studying for an MBA. And finally, coming from Berlin is Tobias Klein-Reiter, who is the global lead for metals and mining for WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. He represents WWF's policy work related to environmental impacts along the supply chain of metals, aggregates, and fossil fuels to the UN, the EU, and on a national level. He's a member of the EIP, that is the European Innovation Partnership Expert Group on Raw Materials at the European Commission, a member of the OECD Expert Working Group for Environmental Due Diligence in Mineral Supply Chains, and holds a Master of Arts in Political Science focusing on environmental policy. So welcome, panel. Thank you again for joining us and giving up the hour. So we've asked the panel to deliver some short opening statements, and then we were asking them some initial questions, and finally we will have a Q&A session. So for the audience, you know, at any point you can type in questions in the chat, and we will get some of these towards the end of the session. So, Gavin, maybe we could start with you, looking at the sort of outlook for metal demand and things like that.
Sure, thanks, Nick, and it's wonderful to be here. Let's get the technology working. Okay, hopefully that's coming through nicely. Now, normally I'd like to take a lot more time to sort of flick through these slides, but I just want to go quickly in order to, I suppose, show some visuals and hopefully connect some dots there. So the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, at the UN level is what driving a lot of the development globally, the development policy agenda. But I think one of the key points here is really how little mining features here. So really, we've only got responsible consumption and production. And so although mining underpins so many of these SDGs, and mining companies and projects can actually contribute to these, the relationship to mining is not very clear. Now, if you look at historically, I suppose the real value of mining, so you adjust this for over time, what we're seeing is this big shift globally, and it's driven by population, it's driven by consumption. And so we're really seeing over the last sort of 25 years, this really big growth in mining. So, but the one thing to note in here is our common metals are still the vast majority of what we're mining, but the stuff that we're needing more and more of are the stuff that's that small white wedge in there, the critical metals, critical minerals, etc. Now, some of these issues are probably well known, but a lot of the reason that critical minerals are often critical is that they're very small markets. They're often byproducts. You often can't mine them directly. You have to mine something else first, like rhenium. You can only get from a molybdenum source, and so sometimes molybdenum itself is a byproduct, say, with copper. And so the other aspect is really the specialized metallurgy that can often be involved, and that's really important for things like rare earths, but also for other metals and so on as well, like scandium and so on. But at the end of the day, what we call critical is really depends who asks the question, who cares about it, and what are their reasons for caring. So it could be at a company level, government level, a regional level like the EU, etc. Now, this is some research that's in process, sort of from work I was doing with Geoscience Australia. Because we have a lack of data for so many of the critical minerals, what do we know? Well, we do know the grades typically of things like zinc. So if we've got sphalerite, we know we're often extracting cadmium out. We can extract other elements actually from sphalerite as well. So we know we can get a broad relationship, say, between cadmium and zinc there on the top right, or if we're looking at hafnium, a geochemical twin for zirconium, we can get an excellent correlation. But for others, the relationship is quite scattered. And if we're looking at the middle bottom there, scandium versus nickel, you unpack that versus deposit types, and you still don't really see much improvement in the patterns or any ability to really discern a relationship that's useful. So it's sort of an area, I guess, we need to know a lot more of. But we can at least use some of these sort of relationships where we have reasonable models to be able to predict how much we have of a particular element, whether it be gallium or indium and many others. If we just look at antimony, I think this is a really important little case study in some ways. And so if you look at historical production there, we can see, I suppose, the light yellow there, the cream sort of color is China. And China's always had a strong presence in antimony, and a lot of that is primary antimony mining. One of the issues, of course, is that antimony can also be produced associated either with gold or as a byproduct, say, at a lead smelter. And so if you look at Australia, we're often considered to be a useful supplier of antimony. We have two sources. One is our antimony mines, often gold and antimony together, but also our lead smelters that have been producing antimony for well over 100 years, and yet there's no data for that, or certainly not for the last 30 odd years. So there's gaps in how much we understand, I guess, about some of the sources and the sort of flows of certain elements. And the stories can vary, but on the bottom right-hand side here, what you can see is the cumulative production over time and USGS data on their best estimates of what global reserves are. And so we're clearly heading upwards. We're not worried about depletion. So really the issue is managing supply, where it's coming from, all the environmental impacts and everything else. Now, lithium is something that's often quite popular to sort of talk about. There's a lot of focus, and so we can see that sort of extraordinary growth in lithium over the last sort of 5 years or so. And Australia, of course, has really leapt to the fore on that, and that's hard rock. So we can see on the right-hand side, if you look at the geology where that's coming from, you can classify the sources either as hard rock, brine, and there's some countries where there's both, but the data is not able to be split, such as China and elsewhere. So really, when you're looking at that, we've been able to meet that growing demand. All right, and I think that's one of the key things. We often hear that it's hard to do, and and certainly it can be, but we can also achieve when we want to. And I think that's one of the really key things that this graph shows very nicely. So let's look at the IEA very quickly. And there's a couple of these, but when you're looking at lithium, this is their best estimates of future lithium demand. And we can see in the sort of the demand outlook at the top here, we can see that the vast majority of lithium demand going forward is for electric vehicles, and a bit for other technologies or other clean technologies, etc. So where that's coming from, of course, probably will still be Australia, the lithium triangle of South America. But at the moment, mines that are committed to supply aren't going to be able to meet that future demand. So there's questions about where do we build the next lithium mines? What are the sort of terms and conditions, the environmental, social, governance sort of characteristics of that lithium supply? And so that becomes an important issue, thinking about the criticality of lithium going forward. Now, this is some work we'll be publishing soon, so I'm happy to sort of at least give a glimpse of this here. And this is work we've done, which is a foresight study looking at the growth of batteries for the UK in electric vehicles. Now, we've had to make assumptions around what battery chemistry will be in the next 25 years. And we can see some of the significant growth in demand by 2030 to 2040 and 2050. And the difference in the columns there for the different elements, for the battery metals, as we often call them, the lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt, graphite, silicon, sodium, and phosphorus, is really accounting for the different scenarios and I suppose some of the uncertainties there. So, but that significant growth hopefully is there. And this is not to say that this is the exact way battery chemistry will unfold. If you look back over the last 5 years, no one predicted LFP would become so dominant as you can see in the bottom wedge there now. So again, it's our best estimates of thinking about this going forward. So if you look at the IEA and nickel, and I think this is a really interesting one because it does create all sorts of dilemmas. Nickel is going to radically change. We're going to see a lot more nickel being used in electric vehicles, primarily for batteries, but of course there's other parts of an electric vehicle that still require nickel as well. And so still strong growth that sort of matches overall, I suppose, historical patterns of growth, but a big shift in where that nickel's used. Now, at the moment, of course, one of the big players or big suppliers of nickel is Indonesia, and there are significant concerns around the environmental and social impacts of that very rapid increase in nickel production in Indonesia. Other alternatives are places like Russia, or we can go to Canada or Australia, where their standards are better, but often considered to be more expensive nickel. So there's some real issues, I guess, in how we're thinking about the future of nickel and what that sort of means. But we need to solve that problem, of course. Now, this is a slightly older slide, but I know I'll pass to sort of Ivo in a second. But what we're looking at is basically how much do we recycle? And so end of life recycling. So when we go to throw something away, how much of that do we actually recycle? And then when we build something or make a new product, how much actual recycled content is actually in that new product? And the devil's in the detail on this, because it's actually, although it stands out that we don't recycle much, some of them, I think, are still significant, overestimates. If you look at titanium, for example, it looks like we recycle more than 50% of titanium, but that's for titanium metal. Most titanium, about 80% of titanium on an elemental basis, is actually used in pigments. So things for paints and paper and things like that. So the titanium here is just talking about titanium metal. So a lot of our data, I guess, is still trying to catch up with what we need to be able to do, what we need to understand, and so on. If we want to be able to manage our supply chains better, we obviously need to collect much better data. So I won't go through these. These are all the sort of issues I've pointed to. But for some sectors, like the platinum group elements, for example, it's going to be difficult to predict how things evolve. But we know we've still got to manage these geopolitical risks. And overall, when you look at the IEA, I think a lot of their key points in their most recent global critical minerals outlook is these 5 points. It's better regulation, so we can better make sure we're protecting the environment and people and governance. So the role of public spending to help improve the supply chains and the resilience, better data, more transparency, and making sure we are operating to really strong sustainability standards. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. And that's a really useful intro. And I think maybe an unappreciated aspect is the small scale of many of these critical metals and what that means in terms of investment and price volatility and stuff like that. Great. I'm sure we dig more into some of those topics in a bit. Ava, would you like to tell us a bit more about what a circular economy really is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope everyone can hear me okay, and thank you very much for the introduction. So as Gavin said, we're in an energy transition environment at the moment. Our materials demand is changing somewhat, but when we're talking about critical minerals, that's quite a small component. And for the past few years, we've been exploring what circular economy means for technology metals in the Met4Tech project. Most of the time when we go out and speak to people, they're like, oh, you're doing circular economy and critical metals, you must be doing recycling. That is the first kind of start point where we go from. But in fact, circular economy is a little bit more than just the end of life and the recycling. It's arisen over time from quite a few different schools of thought and concepts. So things like the cradle to cradle concept in the 1970s, whereas this is basically thinking about materials as almost nutrients for products, talking about kind of regenerative, keeping things in circulation for a long time. Came out of a bit of work on the performance economy. So again, that's talking around business models, product life extension, long life goods, reconditioning those elements. and things like industrial symbiosis. So one person's waste is another person's resource. How do you match up different industries? So when we start pulling that into a more critical minerals viewpoint, we're actually talking about a systems change rather than just individual elements in the system. So one of probably the best known definitions when it comes to describing what a circular economy is that of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And this is basically based on those 3 principles: eliminating waste and pollution, circulating products and materials at their highest value for as long as possible, and regenerating nature. And all of that is hopefully underpinned by the transition to renewable energy, clean energy, and making sure that we have renewable material sources in a resilient system that is good for people, the planet, and prosperity. So you're trying to cover a lot of ground in a circular economy. So although recycling is a core component, and we're going to hear a bit more about that hopefully in the next 2 people in this panel session, there are so many other aspects to it as well. Talking about nature recovery, speaking to who is the better owner of your metal, how do you make sure that your materials are being used in efficient forms in your downstream, but also coming back to the mining sphere, how do we ensure that we have resource efficiency at site? How do we think about mines as not just a single activity, but actually part of the forward history, let's say, the past history and forward history of a patch of land? It's a small part in a very long period of time. So how can we begin to build in this kind of slightly longer term viewpoint of what mining is when we're talking about critical metals? So I think that's kind of what the circular economy is. It's trying to just do better with what we have and making sure that we're not demanding too much from our environment, and making sure that we're reducing the demands in our environment. Again, when it comes to critical raw materials, there are a few things to balance in here. Yes, we want to capture and circulate the value that we're creating from extracting resources in the ground. But again, as Gavin said, they're mined in really small amounts, so it can be really quite hard to get hold of, so you might not have that much control of it. We're trying to get towards that renewable energy system, which means at the moment we need a lot more mining to make up for the gaps in materials that we have. But at the same time, we need that long-term viewpoint to make sure we're doing best by the materials and minerals that we're extracting, so that we're not putting undue burden on the environment. So I think that's generally what the circular economy is trying to achieve, but it's a lot of things to a lot of different people.
Thank you. Thanks, Ava. That's really helpful. It sounds like you touched on the aspect of stewardship, and I suppose that's a really important aspect of all of this. Right, Lucy, maybe you could come in there and now tell us about sort of recovery, recyclability, sustainability.
Yeah, I think that, thank you for that, Eva. That was a brilliant segue. I'll try not to repeat too much of what you've already said. And also thank you, Gavin, for transporting me back to my PhD with those periodic tables and how much we recycle as a real shock to the system there. So alongside the work that I do at the Materials Processing Institute, I'm also co-chair of the Circular Economy Group for the Critical Minerals Association. If you don't know what they do, shameless plug here, please go and have a look at what they're up to. They're doing some amazing work in this space, not just from a circular economy point of view, but generally for the critical minerals, the whole supply chain overall. And a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today does come from that area of work that I do, because my day-to-day job is only slightly tangentially connected. But essentially my interest in this area came up through my PhD when I was working on the sustainability of materials. And I know it's weird to say that you have a favorite SDG, but number 12 is my favorite sustainable development goal. I also believe that it can be linked to all of the others in one way or another based on what it's trying to achieve. And if we think about the fact that one of the aims of that is to reduce our material footprint per capita, we need to consider how we are going to do that. We're not, as Eva's just said, we still need to take materials out of the ground to achieve the energy transition. So how do we make sure that we do that by also reducing our material footprint? And another aim in there is also with regards to recycling and ensuring that we increase the amount of recycling that we do. So from that point of view, one of the good pieces of work that the CMA has done is around a midstream and ensuring that the UK is resilient enough to make sure that moving forward, we have less reliance on external imports from everywhere else that produces these amazing materials, and so that we can be resilient in this transition towards 2050. And how we make sure that we do that is a couple of different ways. Eva's mentioned some of those before, making sure that we use materials for longer, making sure that when I'm not a geologist, but making sure that when we do set up mines, we make sure that we are doing the right thing with regards to the sourcing of the material and how we are gathering it all from the ground. And also how we make sure that when we're refining these processes, refining these materials, we're doing that in an environmentally sustainable way. So we need to make sure that we can commercialize any innovation that's coming through. So right now in the UK, we have very slow growth of getting innovation from a university through to commercialization actually on the ground. And a lot of the work that we need to do just has to start in these universities and move through. So we need to develop and commercialize the right recycling processes. And also that will in turn ensure that we have a solid midstream in the UK, making sure we have our own sources of these materials and therefore reduce our reliance on imports. I think the other thing is thinking about mining itself and considering how we can make the process itself more sustainable. So there's a lot of innovation around at the moment looking, well, I think it's Australia in the main, looking at increasing the use of tailings, but also how we can look at better use of secondary sources. And then if we step away from the mines, how do we make sure that we have secondary use of the components, as Eva's already mentioned, secondary use of the materials. I think then from my point of view, it's always been looking about sustainability as a whole. So if we're coming up with a new innovation, is it environmentally friendly? Tick. Great. Potentially we're looking at a hydrometallurgical process rather than a pyrometallurgical process. Brilliant. Is it economically viable? We're still not in a position right now where we're going to implement something that's not economically viable, so that's always going to get a tick. But for me, the one thing that we don't always think about in enough detail is that social aspect. And yes, we do often think along with the other SDGs about the impact of the people on the ground who are potentially taking these materials out of mines in other countries. But there are things that we can do internally in the UK to make sure that we support that aim of reducing consumption. So how can we work with everyone around us, not just us experts in the field, but people that live next door, to explain about the materials that they are using on a day-to-day basis, whether that be in their laptops, in their phones, in their dishwasher. These materials are everywhere and people just don't know about it. So I think there's a responsibility on ourselves, and Katie, as you mentioned earlier, about doing that communication piece of bringing it to a wider audience to provide better information as to why we're trying to achieve these things. But also, so that's about, I mean, one of the aims of the SDGs is promoting a more sustainable lifestyle, but also looking at how we can support the supply chain in the UK generally by making sure that we have the right skills and making sure that we have the right workforce. So work has been done in a lot of these areas in the UK in heavy industry. We have an aging workforce, and we need to make sure that people coming through are diverse and have the right skills to develop what we need for a sustainable future, whether that be through innovation internally, through companies being innovative, or whether that's through new innovation coming from universities. So for me, we can talk about circular economy and all of the individual parts of that. We can talk about mining, but for me, it's all about taking that holistic view and making sure that we don't just think about mining, but we also think about throughout the life cycle of that material. So hopefully I can touch on some of those shortly.
Great, thanks Lucy for that. Tobias, did you want to say a few words?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks for the invitation to this great panel. So again, like I'm working for the World Wide Fund for Nature, which is the biggest environmental civil society organization in the world. Just to give you some kind of background on that, we're working in more than 100 countries. We have about 8,000 employees, and mining does play a big role on the ground and has a huge impact. So I want to facilitate kind of understanding what those kind of impacts are. We are a science-based organization, which means we do a lot of reports, which we publish to, as Lucy just mentioned, also raise awareness on those issues, right? So we just had last year the first ever global report on deforestation and mining, which is now actually kind of the baseline for a lot of policy being done on that. I will put that in the chat later on. It was published in Nature as well, as we did it together with the University of Vienna, and we just published another one about bringing batteries production to Europe, which, Gavin, might be really interesting for you as well, as we looked into the 4 different kind of battery types and what kind of impact that will create to regulations such as the Critical Raw Materials Act in Europe, but also on a global level, as well as what it actually means to recycling rates and what kind of recycling rates could actually be integrated in those different types of batteries. So if we're looking into the impacts of mining, as we all know, there are a lot of impacts, and so we consider mining being ideally done responsibly, but it can never be done sustainable because it obviously creates an impact on biodiversity, deforestation, and water consumption or discharge. And with the University of Queensland, we, for example, figured out together with Laura Santerre in her paper that the indirect impacts for mining sites are actually 12 times higher, which means infrastructure for those mining sites, not the mining site itself, but as you know, in the Congo Basin, for example, infrastructure about the transport of those ores is up to 400, 500 k's to the harbor, which is also built, right? So infrastructure, indirect impacts does play a big role. Now, when it comes to the numbers about extraction and in deforestation, actually renewables play a big role here because in the end, 71% of all deforestation globally is linked to coal and to gold mining. That means, and this is not me saying that, but this is the Ministry of Environment saying that in Germany, as well as the European Commission, more renewables will lead to less mining, as we can see in India and other countries, as well as in the moment in Indonesia. Most of the energy used for those recycling, as well as for the metal processing, is still from coal energy mixes, right? And one of the questions that Nick asked me about is really about how circular economy plays in. And I think there's one important part here, and this is obviously circular economy is key for resilience within supply chains. We've seen that with the COVID virus. We've seen that now with the Russian war on the Ukraine, that circular economy plays a big role when it comes to resilience, right? Coming back to Germany, 48% of nickel came from Russia. That's not possible because of the sanction rights against Norilsk Nickel at the moment. So we need to diversify our supply chain, and circular economy can play a really big role here. Now, as other speakers said, there are different kind of circular economy approaches, which includes 10 different R's, right? So it's about refuse, rethink, reduce, and so on and so forth. And recycling is only one part of the story, right? So the question is actually, we actually need in the future for some parts also to reduce our demand, to increase our secondary commodities, but this will take decades. And in some for the commodities like copper, there's actually, to be honest, there's kind of a scarcity of about 20% in the next 20 years, right? So for some commodities, it might be feasible. For others, it's more complicated when it comes to the R of recycling, right? And I think one big point about that is, and I think Gavin, you touched a small point on that, is actually pricing, right? So it's the pricing of those commodities, not about the technology behind that. To give you an example about lithium, we do recycle about less than 2% globally, and this is mainly because of pricing. This has nothing to do, well, also technically it's not as easy, but there's also about something mainly about interesting for the car companies being used about pricing of the secondary commodity, which is way higher than primary commodity of lithium out of China, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is rare earth. Rare earth, for example, been flooded by pricing in China in the 70s and 80s, right? So there's a reason that there's no mining anymore in Europe, mainly because of the pricing of rare earth. Now there is a potential to gain those rare earth back out of, for example, tailings. There's a lot of research done by different universities, such as the University of Freiberg in Germany, that there are about 2 years, annual rare earth elements within former tailings of former Soviet Union or GDR sites in Eastern Germany, right? So this is then again about the pricing, because obviously secondary commodities out of rare earth are way more expensive than primary ones, and it's about access as well, right? I want to leave it here, but the mining mining industry can play a big role on sites when it comes to deposits and when it comes to former tailings as well. Over to you, Nick.
Great. Thanks, Tobias, and thanks for all for your opening statements. Just a reminder for the audience, you can put your questions in the Q&A and we'll try and get to some of them towards the end of the webinar. So I think, so let's ask some sort of questions following up those statements. So Lucy, I'm going to come to you first of all. So I think it would be helpful to lay out, if you like, the recycling landscape in the UK and beyond. And, why is critical mineral recycling in the UK important? You know, we touched upon aspects of resilience and supply security and things like that. So
Yep.
please.
So it's probably a very obvious answer to one of those questions of why is it important. We want to achieve net zero in a sustainable way, preferably, I guess, before 2050. We will see whether or not in the long term or short term now, because I keep remembering that we're halfway through 2024. So a long way to go. And from the point of view of why it's important, I don't think it is very important, but it's also not important as a standalone issue, as Eva's already pointed out. And we need to make sure that we have these processes on our shores to ensure that we have access to these materials as we move forward. So with regards to the other things that fit into that supply chain, so we've got the mines for the materials that are available to us in the UK. And again, we need to address those in a sustainable manner. Then we've got refining that needs to be done. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of case studies that we've worked on in the past through the Critical Minerals Association, but there's companies like Less Common Metals over in the Northwest. They produce rare earth elements, mainly melting and casting, but they also specialize in alloys for magnets. They've developed a process where they're essentially using oxides instead of neodymium metal, oxides instead of metal, which means that they can then reduce their reliance on imports from China. So that means that we're already reducing the need to be as part of that competitive edge from the other side of the world. Then you've got people like Tees Valley Lithium, over in, as you can probably guess, the Northeast. So they're looking at low carbon electrochemical processes to produce lithium hydroxide. Now, again, this is another way of producing lithium that doesn't need a mine, but it does require a very good relationship with Australia, which we're working towards to ensure that I'm looking at Gavin there, not that you're there anymore, so that we can make sure that we have the spodumene that we need to then produce the lithium hydroxide. So we still, in that case, are still not resilient alone without the work of anyone else. And then we've got a company called Pensana, who have recently set up on the Humber Freeport. They're looking at rare earth separation, and they're using rare earth sulfates to do that separation. And they're also looking at how they can recycle permanent magnets using hydrogen as a reductant. So from a sort of heavy industry hard tech point of view, there's a lot of innovation going on, but also there is some sort of softer tech innovation that's going on that's also needed to support us through this transition. So companies like Circular, who are looking at battery passports and other capabilities, yes, that will soon be mandated through the EU and requirements for that, but having that access to the data from an environmental point of view and life cycle assessments, which we briefly mentioned earlier from Gavin, is really, really important. And then that allows us to expand the reach of not just thinking about carbon, because that's what we tend to think about, but also looking at other environmental impacts. And also Minviro, who are doing work on LCA and implementing life cycle assessments. So we can actually quantify whether or not these processes are sustainable, and whether or not one aspect is just environmentally friendly. So in the work that I've done in the past, you can have a low carbon process, but it's got a really high toxicity value. And so there's a conundrum there of what's the most important. So there's loads of innovation out there to help us move forward. From my point of view of work that I'm doing now of trying to accelerate that, there's also issues of accelerating the hard tech, which is probably conscious of time, probably for another day. But I hope we do need to make sure that we, as the UK, also support that acceleration of that technology, to make sure that we can achieve recycling, refining, and sustainable mining as well.
Thanks, Lucy. I guess, a follow-up question, maybe we could point this to Eva. I mean, Lucy talked about innovation. When you build sort of models for the circular economy, and I guess you made the point it's more than recycling, but, is innovation the really important thing? Tobias made the point that actually pricing is actually quite important about sort of whether we bother to recycle or not. How do you, where do you see us, the sort of pinch points and the route forwards in improving recycling rates and getting that circularity going?
Yeah. So I think with the circular economy, the whole point is that it's a complete systems change. So at the moment we're in a linear economy, which means that everything is set up. Our innovation is set up for a linear economy. Our pricing mechanisms are set up for a linear economy. Our regulatory systems are set up for a linear economy. So at this point in time, because that is how we have done business, the barriers are really in everything. There are little barriers no matter where you are, and they will just pop up whenever. So, for example, our regulation on waste, really broad definition on what waste is, fantastic from kind of a harm like prevention, making sure that we're not releasing waste into the environment, making sure that our environment is protected. However, once something is categorized as waste, it's very hard to uncategorize it as waste and get it back into recycling systems. So you have this sort of unintended consequence by trying to do the best to make sure that we are protecting our natural environment, protecting people, ensuring we're not releasing toxins into the environment. You have the flip side of that is that, well, if somebody intends to discard of something, then it's waste, and therefore it has to go to a waste facility and is not a usable product. So that's one of the many aspects that then make it quite hard to kind of identify a single barrier or pinch point, because it just is systemic and everywhere, because it does require a different way of thinking, a different way of considering our materials flows in the environment, economy, and kind of from a social perspective. So no easy answer. There are quite a few different barriers. I'm sure everyone on their panel has come across barriers depending which aspect they've looked at this topic from.
Great, thank you. I guess from maybe I'll actually jump to Tobias from a sort of broader European perspective, and especially a policy perspective. I mean, if we're talking about a systems change and there are no easy answers, and actually it's quite difficult to, you know, how do you identify where policymakers should push the buttons and where things should go forwards?
That's an easy answer, easy question and easy answer. I mean, no, I mean, it depends really on the region itself, right? So as I said, we're working in more than 100 offices, and we just been last week at the OECD conference in Paris, and there obviously we had a lot of meetings with ministers and as well as there's a new panel now by the United Nations actually about transition minerals by Guterres, which actually asks the same question, which kind of regulations need to come in place. And I think what Eva just said is really important. So I think it's a holistic change. And one part, I think, for this society here and for those colleagues on the call, the mining code actually plays a big role here, right? When we talk about circular economy approach within mining itself, this goes not only to outside of Europe, like Indonesia, Philippines, a big issue, but actually in Europe itself, we just have, as I'm the expert for this kind of conversation within the German government about the new mining code in Germany, where we can actually access those former tailings from the GDR and the former Soviet Union. That's not an easy task to do that, because there are a lot of regulations in place. So it's about access for those sites, right? And then when it comes to the European part of things, each country has different kind of mining codes. Each country has different kind of regulations in place. So we need to unify. And now, unfortunately, I always have to say that the UK is not part of the European Union anymore. So that has a different role then to play for the UK than actually those member states in the European Union have, right? And we need to have an understanding where we actually can have regulation in place, which actually is united, as commodities don't care about borders, right? So we need to have this in place and really take care about that. And pricing is one part which I explained in the beginning. Taxes could be another one, but it's really about the essential part in the beginning when it comes to mining, which is the mining code, impact assessments and monitoring, stuff like that, which is not unified in the European Union as well as in the UK, which is a big problem.
Right. Okay. No, that's a great point. Gavin, I'm going to come to you and jump a couple of questions and really talk about sort of the role of, you know, when you're looking at metal supply and predictions in metal supply, how do you factor in the growth of the circular economy and trying to work out where those metals come from, given some of the aspects that we've talked about so far in the webinar? I mean, what are the challenges in trying to do that?
I think, well, there's many, and I heartily agree with all the comments that have been made so far. Like, there's no one single solution. There's no one easy answer or button to push sort of thing. So you have to think about everything. And so a lot of that is sometimes there may be technologies, and sometimes if you look at lithium iron phosphate batteries, we've removed cobalt. So okay, we've reduced the criticality of cobalt, but you've also removed the most expensive metal in a battery, which reduces the economic incentives to recycle. So sometimes when you make changes, you actually it can be counterproductive. So I think looking at the future of how all of this sort of stuff comes together, it's always really, really difficult. We have to make assumptions, whether that's assumptions around the extent of mine supply, where that mine supply might be coming from, assumptions around regulatory processes. And so now, of course, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU, so that will have at least some sort of probably indirect effects here in the UK as well, but also affect some of the choices and options for the UK going forward. So, but then we also have to think about the pricing, and heartily support that. That's something that I've often thought about. Is often mining is large scale, and so it's very cheap, and it's concentrated in a particular spot. Whereas recycling, the products, they're very diffuse. The logistics become expensive, and so that makes recycling often an expensive option. Now we do it for various reasons. Sometimes it's easy to do for things like glass or aluminium, perhaps, and maybe copper and steel. But for other things like our electronic goods and so on, it gets much harder. But the value's there. We know that roughly 70% of the metal value in a phone is actually still gold. So there's options, and so some of those options that we have to think about in sort of looking at the way we analyze these systems and sort of look at scenarios for the future, is look at whether it's a technology issue, making sure consumers are also on board, because if you're relying on consumers to bring their goods to a collection point, you need to make sure that consumer behavior, and there's that education there, as well as getting the regulatory settings right, whether those regulatory settings are around, waste versus resource, as sort of Eva was talking about, or just some of the things, incentives around, economic or tax incentives, or, penalties or things like that. So all of those things need to be sort of, looked at, which means it's a complex space, but that's what we need to do.
Great, thanks. I see Lucy's got a hand up.
I just want to add something to that long list that Gavin's just provided. Design in the first place for end of life and recycling. I feel like we've been talking about it for so long, but actually we're still not doing it. So yes, we can redesign a battery to have a reduced amount of cobalt in it, but again, what's the add-on impact? But actually, let's just think about how we can produce a battery so that it can be used in a second, third, fourth life, and then at the end of that life, we not only have the data because we've got a battery passport that goes with it, but we've got a battery that can be taken apart and nice and easily recycled, rather than automatically shoving everything in a shredder and hoping for the best. So that was just to add another thing onto Gavin's lovely long list of things we need to do.
Great, thanks. And Ava, you've got a hand up as well.
Yeah, so what Lucy said just also prompted me around the concept of eco-design. I feel like we need to have a better conversation going between those involved in supplying metals and those involved in using metals, because it's very easy and very quick for someone in sort of materials engineering space to go, oh, we'll just substitute this metal in with another one, we'll change the performance, or it'll have the same performance, but we won't deal with that metal, without the knock-on impact on the mining system that takes decades often to go from exploration to a productive mine, and flipping those supply systems on and off is so tricky that we need to have a better conversation maybe around, okay, are you designing to the metals and materials that we can supply in a sustainable and responsible manner, and have that linked up a little bit more through that eco-design process.
Do you think consumer pressure would drive that, or do you think there has to be a sort of policy?
I think it's a bit of both, probably, but it's quite a technical conversation because it's reliant on us geologists kind of knowing what we can produce, and other people understanding that it's not just flip of a switch, that we can get it from somewhere.
Okay, great. Gavin, and then Tobias. Gavin, just
I'm a great believer in if you educate people, they will choose better. And I think there's many examples of that, whether it's just with paper, whether it's with energy sources. In Australia, we started putting subsidies to solar panels back about 20 years ago, with the expectation that hardly anyone would do it. And it created a revolution. All right. And so because people were prepared to pay and they were prepared to actually, spend the money and get solar panels on their homes. And so that was that really early sort of start. And now with the, solar panels, they're 10 to 20 times cheaper. So I think I'm a great believer that consumers actually are prepared to pay a bit more if you get the outcome and if there's that sort of that visibility of a more responsible sort of product or a more sustainable option. So I'm certainly a great believer in that.
Great. Thanks, Tobias. I think you had.
Yeah, perhaps adding on that, I do believe in awareness raising, right? But I can see for a lot of other commodities that pricing does play a big role. And we can see that now with Temu and companies flooding markets, that pricing does play a role for people, right? Nevertheless, awareness, especially, and this was always my pitch, right? To have like a spoon or something, and people had no clue where it's come from, right? We know where food's coming from. We have no clue where most of the material is coming from. But who am I telling that you're the experts here, right? But I think one part besides the product and the design of things is also actually get into the consumption part. And there's one really great example besides the regulation where there's a right of repair now in the European Union as a regulation, but also like this charger for a phone, right? We had like 10 different chargers, and now there's a regulation in place which only says like there's only one which USB-C as a charger. I think this is actually benefiting also. I don't know how you struggle. I struggle with that, finding the right charger. So there's also like benefiting having less in some parts. And I think this is something we have to educate people as well. So also about the education, but making sure that we can actually repair things in the product itself, but also understand that actually having less doesn't mean we have less in life in general.
Great, thanks. Just looking, we've had a few questions coming in, some of which have been answered. So here's one. Will transitioning to a circular, this is from Anonymous, will transitioning to a circular economy affect supply chains production in a way that negatively impacts the public? What key points do geoscientists and organizations need to communicate to generate support for a circular economy and amongst non-specialists? And I guess this, leans heavily into public opinion. Who would like to have a go at this? Ava, is this, or Gavin?
Yeah, I can have a go. I think at the end of the day, I mean, the whole point with the circular economy is we should be reducing that overall environmental burden. All right. Now, I think the challenge is to make sure we really understand the law of unintended consequences, where we go down one path and we don't actually create a new problem that is either as bad or worse than what we've solved in some ways. So now I think when you're looking at it, and I think Tobias made this point very, very well, is that we know that a third to half of global mining activity, if you include all the waste rock or overburden and tailings that's sort of generated from mining, is coal. So once we move away from coal, and I think now there's much better hope that we can decarbonize steel and things, so we don't need metallurgical coal either, we have less mining overall. And I think when I've gone through the numbers myself, and I've got some work in progress on this, even the big growth rates we're seeing for things like lithium and rare earths doesn't come close to replacing, I suppose, what we're removing with coal. So I think overall we will be in a better position. And I think that's kind of the whole point, is the energy intensity of recycled aluminium is much, much less than primary. And so we could go through the periodic table with looking at that. So I think in general, we should be seeing less environmental burden, and that is kind of the whole point. But handball to you, Eva.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on the other part of that kind of ESG scenario when it comes to circular economy and like society and people and jobs, because a lot of the time when we talk about circular economy, you do get the general opinion that you're trying to put mining companies out of business, and kind of as an ideal end state, yes, there would be a reduction in the amount of mining, and the knock-on effect would that be a knock-on reduction in the number of jobs in that space. So I think, again, going back to Gavin's comment on making sure that you don't have those unintended consequences, that you have that responsible transition, it's about making sure when you're mapping out how you're getting towards a circular economy, you're mapping out all of those areas where there might be shifts in the system. So making sure that if you are reducing mining in an area, that you have some other form of employment and value generation that communities can tap into and can grow with going forward. So not seeing it as one or the other, but seeing it as a transition, as a flow through and kind of a growth of our society and environment.
Great, thank you. Just mindful of the time, so I guess maybe it's time to sort of wrap up and ask people for, final thoughts, really. I mean, we set up the question of what is the role of mining in the circular economy, and I suppose the subset, the implications of geoscience. So maybe I could just spin around the panel and ask for a couple of minutes for each of them. Lucy, let's start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, from my point of view, and Eva's just touched on it, from a sustainability and circular economy side of things, we're not looking to close mines. We still need the mines to be open to enable this sustainable shift. But I think one of the questions, what do geoscientists need to do? How does geoscience play a role in this? And for me, it's about being a responsible custodian of the materials and making sure that everybody in the supply chain continues to be responsible in the way that they use those materials. So linking back to a lot of the things that have already been said, knowing what we've got available, using it in a sustainable way, and making sure that when a component comes to the end of its life, it is again responsibly managed. We can talk about electric vehicle batteries, we can talk about turbine magnets all day, but we have the small portable electronics market has grown by about 77%, I think was the last time that I looked, in the last 10 years. And those are tiny pieces of equipment that have very short lifespans, and there are still materials in there that we can manage. It may not be economically viable to utilize them and to recycle them straight away, but it's about making sure that we communicate to everyone that they know what materials are in use and how we can use them for as long as possible. So I think that's a responsibility, I guess, of all of us. It's not just geoscience and geoscientists, but making sure that we are responsible custodians of these materials, because we are going to run out eventually.
Great, thank you. Tobias, maybe I come to you. Some final thoughts.
Well, I mean, the mining industry has to be part of the circular economy approach as well. I mean, on many levels. I think there's a risk for mining companies not being part of it, right? Because ultimately, as we just talked about, coal does play a big role. And if we have a decrease of coal in the future, need to be part of a different kind of business case. And there are already some business cases which looks into, for example, former tires, which are now used for rubber production in Southeast Asia, right? So stuff like that. And then again, I think the biggest part here is really the technology and the knowledge, like really great knowledge those engineers have when it comes to using commodities out of tailings and former deposits, and really also about the restoration of former mining sites, which also play a big part when we talk about circularity within ecosystem services, right? I mean, there are a lot of examples in the UK itself about abundant mining places, right? So they're parts on that. How can we restore those? How can we have actually better access for ecosystems such as fresh water and clean air to communities? And I think they can play a big role, and they did play a big role in the last 100 years, right? But also negatively, but also positively. And I think there's a part of that where mining companies need to play a big role, but ultimately they need to align each other, right? There's a lot of distinction between companies, and they're the better ones and they are not so good ones. So it really depends where you look into. So we aligning on that, and therefore associations do play a big role, such as ICMM, for example, to have a common ground and common understanding and put circular economy within the principles really high within ICMM, for example.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Gavin, role of mining, you say?
Yeah, we'll still need mining for metals and all of the different things. But as we do that and we build up the technologies and the sort of the stocks, I guess, across our landscapes, our urban landscapes and industrial landscapes, of course, we have to improve the way we recycle and look at building that sort of circular economy there in the very complex multitude of ways that we do. But the key thing I always keep coming back to is we need good standards, right? Standards on product design, on how mines are operated, sustainability governance, for example. There are various ways we do that, but we need good standards that really talk to that. And I think the CRM Act certainly aims to achieve that, which I think it's noble. I know a lot of people sort of complain about it, saying it's not achievable, but I think we need to set those good standards. Otherwise, we're at great risk of achieving a low bar, and that doesn't help us at all. So the other thing that I think goes hand in hand with that, and it's really good to see the IEA actually articulating this, is that transparency and data. All right, how do we know that we're achieving something if we're not monitoring and measuring things properly, and being transparent about that? All right, so I think that's a really critical sort of issue that often gets overlooked. So that way, whether it's at a government level, at a company level, even at a community level, you know, a regional level or things like that, I think we need, you know, both the standards, the transparency, and the data. That's the sort of key messages I always keep coming back to.
Right, thanks, Gavin. And Ava, I've given you the last word.
Final thoughts. I think geoscientists in general are in quite a privileged position for being able to study the Earth's environment and its system throughout time and looking forward. So it is our role to a certain extent to articulate all of those things about where materials come from. We're often the first on the ground in places when we're doing exploration, trying to understand the Earth system. And I think for the most part, most geoscientists are also environmentalists. I think it's in our best kind of, I don't know, to our benefit that we articulate where materials come from and therefore why we need to look after them better in our economies going forward. So I think that's where we fit.
Stewardship again.
Stewardship.
Great. Well, thanks to all our panelists again. Really appreciate your insights. We could have gone on for another hour or two. I'm sure we didn't answer half the questions that we were going to, but thanks again, and thanks to the audience for joining us, and thank you to the JOLSUC for hosting us. So have a good afternoon.